When it comes to exploring animism and the magic of and with place, I like to borrow a term from the world of wine: terroir. Terroir is generally understood in the wine world as the sense of place, soil, geography, seasonality, and even culture that can be expressed in a glass of wine. When it comes to magical terroir, we are referring to how all of those same factors develop into unique and co-creative spiritual practices. There are many unique features to the land I'm living on that converge to form a magical sense of place. A crow's fly away from Mount Shasta, I live in the middle of a rain shadow that divides the region into dense mountainous forests and desolate prairielands. Although abused and unforgivably wounded, the native tribes of the region are deeply present with strength and resilience. The Shasta, Karuk, Wintu, and Modoc are very much alive, telling stories and carrying traditions that were co-created with this place over millennia. Although Mount Shasta is more often thought of as a UFO hotspot, it was also arguably the birthplace of Neo-Paganism in the United States. On May Day in 1915, when the self-proclaimed Druid Ella Young brought the notion of the Wheel of the Year, along with other Celtic Revival reconstructions from her native Ireland to her newly founded Fellowship of Shasta. An hour to the north, and 15 years later in Ashland, Oregon, Victor Anderson, who co-founded the uniquely American traditional witchcraft tradition called Feri, was initiated into a secretive group called the Harpy Coven, which would profoundly influence the foundation of his own order. Zooming in on my personal home in the bioregion it is situated in reveals the distinct influence of an Alpine terroir. We live in a valley on the edge of a forest of cedar, fir, pine, and maple. Jutting 5,000 feet above us are the Marble Mountains, which are some of the last to give off snowmelt each year, that flow into, sometimes rugged, sometimes bucolic, creeks and streams that eventually feed the Klamath River Basin. In the darkest months of winter, the snow lingers in our valley, sometimes weeks longer than in the neighboring valley, just 20 minutes away. The summer begins with morels and wild dogwoods in bloom and gives way to a foraging season of elderflowers and elderberries, feverfew, mugwort, blackberries, and rum cherries. All this is to say that my magic is deeply influenced by this alpine land and the spirits that inhabit it. One of my favorite magical rabbit holes is looking into the folk magic practices of other alpine cultures to find ideas and inspirations that I can fold into the mystical soup of these California Alps. Christian Brunner has made it a personal project to translate and collate the magical terroir of the European Alps and share it with the rest of the world. In his book, Alpine Witchery, Christian dives deep into the witch trial records of the Alps, which he himself translated, to mine for the lore, ritual, and spirituality that paints a fascinating picture of the folk magic of its day and possibly exposes elements of the survival of an even older and deeper alpine magical terroir to explore. Christian Brunner, welcome to Radical Elf Fam. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure on my side.
Hell yeah. I was kind of telling you before we hit the record button, but when I heard about your book, Alpine Witchery, I was very excited because it dovetails two of my biggest interests in my life, one being witchcraft, which is kind of my primary spiritual pursuit, and then the Alps as a concept, because my normal life is making wine, and our focus, because we're at such a high elevation, is on alpine varieties. So very excited to kind of dive in and see where it takes us.
Yeah, that's good. I actually grew up in a wine region
Oh, yeah.
myself,
Which one?
in a very old one. So we know that the Romans that were stationed there along the Danube, which is, I don't know, through a 30-minute drive from where I grew up, um, they grew wine on the eastern edge of the Alps because A, the soil was really good for that, and B, they were the way it's sort of southeast east, I guess, the way it's located. At least the sun until late afternoon really shines and leans into those not very steep mountainsides there.
Yeah, we are near Mount Shasta, which is not like a very historic wine growing region in the United States because of the elevation being so high for California, and we're kind of surrounded by multiple mountain ranges. And I've actually often described it as like the California Alps to folks when we're talking about the wines and stuff. But yeah, we don't have a lot of Austrian varieties, but we have Brunner, Veltliner, and then Gewürztraminer and Riesling, and then stuff
Mm-hmm.
that kind of edges into France and Italy. So like Rafosco and Trousseau, those types of things. But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm excited to hear a bit about the magical terroir of the Alps, as well as kind of my preconceived notions about it from like a wine perspective. But before we kind of go there, just a bit of like a get to know you question. I'm curious, when in your own personal life, magic became real for you. If there's a biographical moment that you could pull from to give a little bit of your history.
Yeah. So the very first maybe, and it sounds probably a little bit I don't know, naive maybe or something like that, but it was definitely something that just confirmed what I've been reading. Back then, so I was reading Carlos Castaneda, and that was in the mid 70s. So we got those books. We didn't know about the person very much, especially over there. You can. There's definitely some knowledge now about Castaneda that makes you question some of the things that he, not so much maybe his person. Let me say it this way, and then some of his writings, but the core of what I read was there is a non-ordinary reality, and you can tap into that. And one of the ways he described that is what and I read it in German, so I have to translate it basically. He called it not doing, which is basically, in the sense, for example, looking at something not the way you usually do. For example, you have a tree, and then you look at the form of the tree. What you don't look is the space between the leaves, and that was sort of. But you still look at the tree, but you recognize it and get the sense of its shape and form by looking at the space in between. It's something actually that in painting is also often used, that the outside space kind of making the form. So I was sitting in my parents' garden. I was a kid basically then still, and and doing that with grass. So I looked at the shadow of the single grass. What are they called?
A blade.
Blades. Yeah. Sorry, I've been now in for 3 weeks in Austria, and that usually deteriorates my English. My children make a lot of fun of me because my accent gets worse, and I forget words. So at the shades of the blades, and just like for you know 10, 15 minutes, and it kind of, you get that sense of you're looking at something that is no longer grass and
Mm-hmm.
soil. It is sort of a living entity that you're looking at. And at some point, of course, your concentration fades. And I looked over the whole backyard of my parents, and there was a spot there in the grass that was um, like as if light, as if it emanated light, right? So as if there was a source of light in there. So I walk over there and found a bracelet necklace that I've lost a long time before then, right? In the grass. So as I said, there's like 1,000 explanations probably for that. But the connection basically between doing that and changing my whole attention, and that's a big part of Castaneda's writings, is that you change your attention on the non-ordinary reality, and which is in a different type of attention, and then all of a sudden finding that was just like my 16-year-old self experiencing, whoa, there might be something behind that. Then fast forward, I don't know, at least 10, 15 years, I did some shamanic work with a colleague, a work colleague. She had a motorcycle accident and shoulder problems ever since. And so I did something that's called in shamanic practice an extraction, so pulling something out of a body that doesn't belong there energetically, so it's not actually in there. But what I got in the vision, or in a journey as we call it often in shamanic practice, was that I should close that wound that of course only exists in the non-ordinary reality with melted amber, hardened tree sap.
Mm-hmm.
So I grabbed one and went back into sort of this state of attention and basically melted that hardened sap, that amber, and let it drop into the wound. So again, it's all, you don't see it. I mean, you see it in your mind, but it doesn't actually happen in the apparent world. Now, after a while, I'm done, and I'm telling her, so we're good. Let's talk about the whole experience. And she said, yeah, she wants to go to the bathroom quickly. There was kind of a tension, and she ran to the bathroom and comes here back much happier than she left to the bathroom. It's like, I'm so glad that you didn't burn my dress. And I said, how would you think that I burned the dress? And she said she felt this intense heat at the end of what I was doing, and thought that I were actually doing something that burned her dress. And that was just the hot melted amber that was all in the other reality. And so that was then much more defining moment, but it was not the first one, right? Say if someone else basically experiences something that happens only in a reality that is not agreed upon apparent world.
That's amazing. I love that. That's an incredible experience. Yeah, I've not read a lot of Castaneda, but I do get the sense that there's something of like a throwing out the baby with the bathwater with some of the controversy around him. It seems like the biggest issue was that he was kind of plagiarizing and presenting information falsely. Not that the information didn't have any sort of basis in like actual Native American and Mexican metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
And I know quite a few practitioners that I have a lot of respect for who also cite Castaneda as like an early influence. So there's clearly something there that worked.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I don't know about his cultural inheritance and so forth, where he came from, and whether or not he appropriated some of the shake, I think they're called, if I pronounce it correctly, customs and traditions. But I think what threw a lot of people off was that he wrote those experiences as factual. And my personal gnosis basically is that he wrote down shamanic journeys. So
Mm-hmm.
what he experienced in his visions, he wrote down as fact. Like I drove to southern Arizona, wherever that is. He might have actually been lying in his LA apartment and having that as a vision, but he wrote it as factual. And he writes also, and that is one thing that I really find very important for shamanic practice, is that you accept what you experience in your shamanic journey as a reality. It's not the same reality. That's a very important thing. Also, you have to be able to distinguish between those two realities and not pop over there without wanting to, because that is then going towards mental illness if you cannot control it anymore. But I think that's what he wrote down, his shamanic experiences. But many read that as factual things that he did, and were then taken aback when they found out it wasn't things that he actually did. Um, And I came to that conclusion later on, working shamanically with actual shamans from Tuva, so from Siberia, the way they worked. And the idea to lie down and drum and, do certain rituals before them, they were beyond that already in there because they were practicing tribal Siberian shamanism, where the word comes from, and so forth. So, and that we were in the week long work with them. We were at some point allowed to basically ask them, I have a problem with this and that. And in my sense, it was my back. I really, I'm a chiropractor and all that. And that shaman was, first of all, standing in front of me. He was not lying down and, having someone else drum. He was just standing there with the worst drum you can imagine. There was no tension of, over the frame. That was just like some wavy, very loose skin, probably deer skin or something, not even stretched over the drum. So that was one of the things. Like there was no beautiful sound that carries you away. It was just like a very dull thump thump thump. Um, and what he explained was basically he so standing there hitting his drum like 4 or 5 times, and then he sees what he called they were speaking Russian. So he was I picked up the word demon, right? But in the Russian pronunciation, but he so otherworldly beings, and they would tell him what's wrong with the person in front of them, and for them it was at that moment the reality that demon, whatever. I don't think we should think of them in the Judeo-Christian idea of a demon, but whatever that was, and telling him what to do. And then the interesting part was he asked me to lie down on my belly, and then he basically did chiropractic on me. But this was like a, I don't know, 80-year-old guy, a little bit frail already, but he basically jumped on my back with his knees and elbows and, arranged it. And so for him, it was less of a, you know, what is it called, a non-ordinary thing. He just knew what to do and which bones to crack by what the demons told him. And again,
Mm-hmm.
not real, not those Hollywood demons, of course.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, that's wild. I think the most interesting aspects of like witchcraft that I kind of am drawn to seem to have like a perennial shamanistic quality to them, and fundamental to that is, frankly, visualization, but getting to the point where you don't you don't question it, like you described. Like that is so like fundamental to getting to kind of like actually get these things to work in you and outside of you. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that's super interesting to point out. I love that. Um, I have heard you mention the shamanism from your background, and then also Druidry, which I find very interesting. And I haven't had many people on who are kind of like active Druids. So I would love if maybe for the listeners who maybe have a bit more of like a folk magic or witchcraft background, if you could describe some of the distinctions for you between like Druidry and, let's say, like witchcraft.
So being a druid is mostly a role in a community. In that's how I perceive it mostly, and it's also part of that druid path that I chose. So, and it goes back to uh, ancient times or antiquity, whatever you want to call it, so 2,000 years ago, roughly, where that role was fulfilled by uh, individuals within a tribe, or then later on within kingdoms, who were educated. They were educated in law, the laws of the tribe of the kingdom. They were educated in history, so they knew the whole history, usually also very related to to the tribe or the community they were working in. They knew healing, and that was definitely something that was of great interest for me. Also, divination, not necessarily what we do now, tarot and astrology, although that played a little bit of a role back then. They were also the communicators with the gods and nature and so forth. The core element of that role was to benefit the community. May that be the tribe of the kingdom. And that's sort of what I find interesting in that whole thing. And it's when we think about shamanic practice, which is very archaic and direct and very even older, let me say that, than Druidry. Right? And then Druidry, it's kind of an intellectual overlay over that, with a lot of history and herbalism, but more structured than the ecstatic shamanic practice. And one of the things that I'm always, or that I find fascinating, and I'm always pointing out when we talk about the role of the Druid in society, between, especially between 2,000 years ago and now, is when we think about that festival of Lunasat, we just had in the beginning of April. Because what we actually commemorate is that Lu's foster mother gave her life because of exhaustion, because she was basically ridding Ireland, or big parts of Ireland, of the trees. So horrible thought today, actually, to just fell trees en masse just to get more fields. But back then it was what the tribe, the kingdom, or the kingdoms of Ireland needed. They needed to feed themselves. So that was the role back then, to serve the community by creating space for agriculture. Today, we Druids are very much known for loving trees and all that, and I do. I mean, I'm fascinated by trees, and so that role basically has changed insofar as we are protecting now nature from being, having that fate that we celebrate at Lunasat, which is kind of a ironic thing that we have a celebration of something that we would be appalled today by. But that's actually the core element. What I think is like the service to the tribe back then was to create an agricultural space, and now it would be to protect exactly what Lou's foster mother did. So it changed a lot in the last 2,000 years, but there's still the same core element in it, which is, that of service to the community. And nowadays, I mean, there are lawyers, there are doctors, medical doctors, there are historians, there are teachers in all levels of education that fulfill those roles that one person had with him, and musicians and poets and all that. So as a modern contemporary Druid, you pick a few things that are important to you, but you do them in service to the community. So mine is looking into my home countries or home regions history, which is very small. The Alps are known and a large part of Europe, but in the wider worldwide community, there's not as much, of course, about the Alps known about them, what are traditions and what has happened there in the last hundreds of years. And that's sort of in one sense my service to the community, to my tribe, if you will, here, to bring that knowledge into the world, and that manifests in books like Alpine Witchery.
I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I've always seen like the distinction between Druidry and Witchcraft as kind of Druidry is using a lot of the same tools you would in Witchcraft, but like you described, for like benefic society serving purposes, whereas like you mentioned to me, witchcraft is almost more shamanic in certain instances where it's not always putting a human first. It maybe putting a spirit first or a forest first, so it's this kind of like non-dualistic, kind of amoral guide, but with similar techniques and tools. I know, does that something that sounds right to you?
Exactly. So in that aspect, or in that context, witchcraft is really, in my view, a tool that possibly even developed out of Druid, of one part of the Druid, of the healing and magical part, that they definitely was part of their practice as well. So, that in itself is fascinating. It's also like, you know, kind of the systematics behind witchcraft fascinate me as well. Sort of, especially when we talk about sympathetic magic. Even when we talk about poking needles into puppets or dolls or whatever, or what I describe in the book, like hitting a puddle with sticks to mimic the sound and waves in the puddle of raindrops to cause rain to fall. Of course, there's always then in witchcraft the intent, and that could be that often then is judged. Sometimes rightly so, sometimes not so much. Um, and when we think about them going back to Druidry and back to Louis Fosterman, what would be if someone would fell trees in that amount, we would find that with magic, let me say this way, we would find that as being like left-hand path or something like that. Back then it wasn't, so that changes over time, and the intent of witchcraft, more often than not, I would say people would fail in their judgment, even when we talk about rainmaking. Because in the book, I'm presenting a few instances where it was clear that someone would make or cause rain as what is that called? In revenge. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it was done to, because there was a drought. But they would do the same method. And so, it's especially when we go back hundreds of years to judge the intent, that's gets a little bit tricky to feel good about one's own personal judgment, influenced by so many things that may or may not have influenced the person who did actually that act of witchcraft.
That makes sense. Yeah, I really appreciate at the start of your book how you tackled exploring kind of like the complicated nature of using witch trial records to glean spiritual insights. I
Mhm.
think some folk who look at, witch trials from the outside either see it as being, this was completely made up. This was all, under derision. So these are fantasies and these are really just victims. And then, people that are a little bit more in the magical community often are, parsing through these records to try to find snippets of old lore, that can be mined and used today. And I like how you say, it's not really black and white. It's a more nuanced reality when you look closely at what is said in the trial records. So I'd love if you could kind of just go into your view on, the nuances between what was coercive and what was more authentic lore, whether the person saying it practiced it or not, but at least was talking about something they'd experienced probably in their lives. Yeah.
Well, one sometimes very helpful element in the trial record is that they actually mention under what type of interrogation a person said what, and that about the literally translated into the pain-free and the painful interrogation. When it comes to the painful torture, the painful interrogation, then you can pretty much assume that that was just said in order to stop the torture and not what they actually did. Most of the spells that were revealed in those trials come from the prior interrogations that were not under duress. So that's already a good distinction. The second one is, and that goes a little bit into history and what was going on at that time, is that the Witch Hammer that was written by Henricus Institores, or began to talk about the devil being behind everything that witches did or didn't do. And whenever a person admitted to that they did something with the devil, that is usually an indicator for these made up things to stop the trial. And often stopping the trial because they were tortured so much, they were in horrible conditions, held in prisons and so forth, just to end it all. And like I'm get me out of that. And if that's the beheading or the hanging or the pirate, and so may be it, but I want to stop that life and pain. So that helps a lot. And the other thing is things that again make sense in terms of sympathetic magic. Most folk magic goes into that. I only saw one spell by a person who was known to be educated in conjuring demons. But the spell is not about that. But in the trial records, it says that he knew about that, or not even directly, but just by using certain names, when you're able to figure out that he must have been educated in or have read a certain book that was published a few decades before his trial about demon magic. So most of it is sympathetic magic. So that's not something. How should I say it? It's too simple almost to make up. Let me say it this way.
Mm-hmm.
The third element is if you find more of the same in various trials, and then I found some that were actually reflected in books of magic in England, and something even very similar in a publication of Appalachian magic. So that was not a single thing that somebody made up quickly at a trial. It was something that, and it's a fairly complicated spell. So that you three, at least geographically distant people, noted.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you did the translation work for this yourself, correct? On these records?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. Very impressive. So yeah, more prevalently in the culture are kind of like the Scottish and English witch trials. A little bit more recently, the Basque, I'd say. I'm curious if there's some noticeable variants to the Alpine witch trial records in terms of maybe thematics or a lack of something that you would have seen in England, just something unique about it that you noticed from what you've read other places.
Um, yeah. So unfortunately, I don't know as many specifics of the other places, but I can say a little bit about what I think is different. Um, what we know of the witch trials in the Alps is that, and I have to preface that maybe I work in a nonprofit and I do data evaluation there, so I do a lot of stats and math and you use the data to decide different new approaches to help homeless families. So that said, when I worked on that book, one thing that I did was to also take note of the trials, some specific elements of the trials, such as the gender of the accused, the social standing of the accused. Were they farmers? Were they tradespeople or clerics in some cases and so forth? What the accusation, but the main accusation was it one of these devil related? were the maleficium cases, which were simply like poisoning and making cows give bloody milk, things like that. And then what the trial outcome was, were they acquitted, which did happen, and were they, what kind of punishment they received. And so in this 400-year period that is roughly covered in the book, you see variations and patterns, basically, a variety of patterns. And one of them is that in the 30 Years' War that started in the 1630s, during and after, let me say it this way, a lot of um, war veterans came back from those wars not being not having learned anything, because they started their soldier career when they were 14 or 15 or something. They never learned a trade. They didn't learn really farming. So they came back and didn't have any way to make money. And so they were dirt poor, didn't have anything, didn't have any assets as in a home and livestock or anything, lived in the outskirts of the community. And this group was outcasts, basically. And what the social network for this group and for the widows from the wars and the orphans from those wars, the social net was to go from farmer to farmer or farm to farm and beg for food and shelter, which is sleeping in the stables usually. And so at the same time, originally, even before that, there were sort of unwritten or written laws in the communities how much a farmer would have to give and how many nights they would have to allow the person to stay there based on the size of the farm. And so when you imagine that was sort of all kind of leveled out and worked out for under normal circumstances. And then you have this huge influx of poor people of all kinds of walks of life. So orphans, widows, veterans, and then those that were already, you know, the poor in the community, needing those services from the farmers and needing food from them. And at the same time, you have a you know the workforce basically was reduced because of the wars as well. And so the farmers didn't have as much to give themselves. So at some point, this equilibrium broke down. And at that point, the farmers went after the poor, basically, and accused them a lot of witchcraft. And they did. They did sometimes these very little small, favors to farmers to help them. But they were overburdening in that era the social net, and those were the ones that were then accused. And you see also that the punishments were harsher during that time. There were many more males at that time as well because of the veteran situation. That changes. So during that war, a lot of males, a lot of veterans were gone after. In other eras, it was so there's the share of women was much higher, for example, than during that time. So it is. I don't know if the same happened in England, Scotland, or even in France, and if it was related to political and sociological situations like in the Alps. Although I've heard that there was some, what was this narrative that I have heard a lot is that, especially in the British Isles, that women were accused of witchcraft and gotten rid of because of they had some real estate that others were interested in. So again, widows, that's probably. Whereas, for example, there is one case that's very interesting in the Alps where noble woman, 8 times widow, immensely rich, came up not even accused, but came up in, was mentioned in two witch trials about a decade apart from each other as having hired witches to cause bad weather, but only on the fields of her competitors, not on her own. So that was known. That was known to the judges. That was known to the clerics that went after witches. Nobody dared, like, officially charging her. So, because she was noble, she was that rich, she was basically untouchable. So not even the church basically had a chance against her, for example. So social status definitely played a role, at least in the Alps, and deference to that class of people that are not going to go. Clerics, on the other hand, there are a few that gotten into trouble, but usually they were acquitted. So they sent away and acquitted and then sent away. So it turns out that social status was definitely played a big role in whether you were accused and or in the outcome of the trial.
That's very
How
interesting.
specific
Wow.
that is to the Alps, I don't know.
Yeah. No, that I'd say, especially the veteran piece, is something I have not heard much of from other accounts and the stuff I've looked more into. Um, I'm curious, does an Alpine equivalent of fairies come up very much in Alpine witch trial records?
Now we're getting into very interesting part because I not absolutely not in the same way that we hear it from, you know, the Welsh and
Hmm.
Ireland and Iceland. There are definitely creatures that some similarities to that, to fairies. And um, I'm when I think of fairies, I guess it's not that Disney, Tinkerbell
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
So during the winter months, and especially between the winter solstice and January 6th, there are creatures around that have, in my you know sense, and very loosely, um, a similarity to fairies. They abduct people, definitely hurt people if they don't do what is expected to them. And I mean, Krampus, for example, is probably the most well known creature in that during that time. Although he is only on December 5th, no other day, and isn't part of that winter solstice group, but he's a sort of a precursor to it. And then during that time, there are um, creatures that haunt people that, you know, what is it? They come through the keyhole into your bedroom and sit on your chest for you
Mm.
to have horrible dreams. And there's this, I don't remember what the name is, but when you wake up and you can't move at all, it's just you're half
Sleep
awake.
paralysis. Yeah.
Yes, that they cause that. So
Hmm.
so those are things that sometimes in fairy lore you hear as well. Abduction of babies and um, of people that who disappear and then come back totally changed. And but that would be sort of the extent. What we hear see and what lore talks a lot about are all kinds of gnomes that are definitely not always benevolent to people. But there is one in particular that I am fascinated. It is called the Casamandel, which is a gnome that lives from November 11th, this is how it precises it, to April 24th in the Alpine huts, where then over the summer, the actual casa, the people who take care of the livestock in the high pastures, who make cheese out of their milk and butter and all that. They moved on in September, between September and November 11th. That's the last day one should be up there. And then the Casamandel moves in. And if you hang out there longer than that, they can come after you.
Hmm.
But they also know a lot about herbs and healing herbs. So you can go there and ask them for, but you have to eat their food. And apparently that tastes horrible. And they get really mad at you if you not even like if you raise your eyebrow when you first taste what they make. So and paralyze you and throw an axe into your back and things like that. So they're definitely not nice, but they have a lot of knowledge. And if you are kind of strong enough, I guess, and at the same time humble enough, they will help you. But beware of their fire. They're not. So that would be. They they also remind me of my grandfather. he was he was he was much. It was probably like 5 inches shorter than I am, and very. He could get angry very quickly, but then forgot about it like 5 minutes later. But so he could have been one of those. Who knows? But that's
Maybe
pretty
he is
much.
now. Maybe he is now.
Could be that he haunts some huts up there.
That's interesting to me. So it's like kind of around old Halloween to almost Beltane. So it's this kind of like winter time.
Mhm.
And then it's sort of like an ordeal. Like if you can face this creature, you might be able to come back with boons, but you have to
Mhm.
be, brave enough to do it. I love that. That's really fascinating.
Yeah,
It's kind of like
yeah, it
going out to
makes
the crossroads.
yeah. Uh, I am in the process of writing a book with two fellow Austrians about exactly that time. So
Interesting.
all of the things that we do from November 1st through Walpurgisnacht on April 30th, and about all the creatures and so forth. So we it's currently in its second sort of review with Llewellyn, and so it's bound to come out next September. It covers about 26 of those creatures and the
I'm
things
very
that the
excited
lore
for that.
around them, the food everything in Austrian Alps has something to do with food. So there are recipes in there and how to make sure that they don't get you. So that there's like, for example, something where you shouldn't have any flax or wool left on the spindle after the winter solstice. And if a certain of those creatures, the Percht, finds it, and so it looks through the window and sees that you have leftover flax or wool to be spun from before the winter solstice, she comes to you at night, slits open your belly, and stuffs that flax or wool into it. So she's also not a very. She's harsh, but if you follow the rules, you don't have to fear anything.
I'm very interested for that book. We'll have to have you back on when you get that one out there.
It
That
comes
sounds
out.
amazing. I really loved in this book, in Alpine Witchery, the way you kind of present a lot of the spells, where you kind of have like a three-part, where you talk about the case that you pulled them from. You
Mm-hmm.
present, the spell or the charm or the ritual, and then you also kind of give like a modern context for how you could adapt or use it.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a really interesting way to present the information. And I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I'm curious if you have any favorite examples to pull from this book that you think are particularly applicable to like a modern practitioner.
Mm-hmm. I would say definitely, and I have tried and or practiced pretty much or almost all of the weather making spells. Um, Usually in times of drought or in times of flooding and so forth. So that's definitely I. I'm not a big fan of love spells.
Hmm.
So I'm very much into, if it doesn't
Consent.
work in consent and free will, if it doesn't work out without that, then it's not going to be working out too well in the end. Although I mentioned that they were part of it. What else is in there in the healing practice? Well, sometimes they're a little bit too radical, I guess. Um, to I mean, you could, I guess, practice, but one asks to rip apart a hen and put it on a person's head, then they smoke something. So that, but you would have to find someone who's willing to do that, to have that done to them, which is
Just
probably
imagine hot amber on your patient
yeah,
instead. It's way easier, right?
exactly. Um, yeah, so I guess I would say the most that I've done is the meta magic part.
I mean, the world we're living in today, weather magic seems pretty important. So
Mhm.
it makes a lot of sense that that'd be incredibly applicable to practitioners now. That's really, I like that. That's fascinating. I was mentioning, I think before we hit the record button, but I love, when looking at kind of bioregional and animistic practices, bringing in the wine word terroir to like look at magical terroir. So what's the sense of place represented in a specific area's magic? So I was wondering, pulling examples from this book, but also more broadly, I know you've written other books on kind of Alpine magic. What do you see as kind of like the magical terroir of the Alps, maybe that makes it distinct from other, let's just go with like European regions or nearby regions?
Could you? I'm not familiar with the word terroir. Hold on.
Yeah, so if I were talking about wine, I would be talking about how Riesling in this part of Austria tastes a certain way because it's lower and it has granite soils and it has like more sun exposure. So the result is going to be a distinct expression of Riesling versus, to put it in this like Alpine perspective, if you grow Riesling higher up in the mountains, higher elevation, it's going to be more severe. The acidity is going to be higher. So it's going to express itself differently. And the people that live up there are used to more extreme weather. So that plays something into the way they make the wine and what they eat with it. So it starts to kind of like create its own little genre or expression. So to me, being where I'm at in California, there's going to be influences that come from Native American culture and New Age culture. And, like there's these things that will seep into my life and experience in a way that if I'm in New England, it might be very different. What is influencing it? You might have more of this like older immigration from Europe coming in before America was founded. That's a part of like what you're pulling from. So that's I guess kind of what I'm trying to talk about is like what do you see as this kind of like what is unique about Alpine magic that maybe from a different region?
Okay. Yeah. Again, always learning new words. Yeah, that's a good thing about exchanging. So what? And I hope I don't disillusion people too much when I say this. And this is also a very big part of the new book. Most people know the Alps, or many, and especially in the United States, know the Alps through that movie, Sound of Music. It's the beautiful, serene. So in the movie, almost always nice weather. People are all happy, and life is just good. Now, and that's true. It's a beautiful place. The majestic mountains, and if the weather is nice and everything is working out well, it's really a magical, and in a good sense, magical place. Winter especially is harsh. You have, of course, avalanches, but you also have often months in valleys. We live in a remote valley where you are totally cut off of the world around you. And so you have to live on your own, um, you know, food sources that you gathered over summer. And that is hard enough, especially in the high Alps. You have to rely on the food for that you stored often way up in the mountains for your livestock that you have to bring down on sleds. That's the only way to move anything then in winter. So it can be a really harsh place. And that is reflected often in, especially in lower, and this two-faced thing, that is serene and beauty of the Alps and the harshness of nature that you experience in there as well. Yeah. So and you have that in summer too. I mean, I remember going up on hikes or a couple of decades I do a lot of mountain biking. You would leave in the morning. It's a beautiful day, and over noon, all of a sudden, a huge thunderstorm would build, just because of local. It's very so that it builds locally basically, and you sit on your bike trying to get down, and the lightning goes off left and right. So you have this almost the dangerous situations that you're in, and again that reflects and how to deal with them. And so first of all, people have kind of manifested them in those creatures that we just talked about. For example, the magic. I don't know. The thing is that I it's hard for me to compare it to other cultures, like for example Western Europe or flatlands or something like that. Because, but definitely in lower, and that there's always a connection between lore and magic and witchcraft. I think that you can see that duality, and that people are a totally aware of it, and b have often done magical acts or witchcraft to kind of keep those dangers at bay. For example, on January 6th, there are parades through the villages, and of these creatures, where people basically dress up as these creatures. And there are always in one person in that parade that is dressed up as a witch. Traditionally, it's a man who does that. So the cross dressing is very important in that. And their job is not to cast spells or anything, but what they do is they go into the houses, so that the parade would stop in front of the house. The family would come outside. They greet each other. Often that whole thing is very ritualized. And then some of them would go into the house, especially the witch, with their broom, and sweep out the old year, the old energy, the energy of the old year, as a magical act to get new energy into the house, and sweep out the wind, and those creatures, so those like horns and terrible, terrifying masks and so forth. Their job is to scare away the harshness of winter or winter itself. That's kind of how we in the Alps figured, that there are two ways. There's these horrible looking creatures. Their job is to scare away the bad spirits. And then there are people that have kind of contraptions on their shoulders. It looks like a hat, but they're carrying on their shoulder because there's like 50 pounds heavy, often as tall as the person itself. There's a lot of mirrors on there, and those mirrors are meant to, because when the bad spirits see themselves in the mirrors, they take off because they're scared of themselves, I guess. So they have to come in some of those parades. Those men that carry those very heavy contraptions and very long, with all the mirrors and flowers on them and ribbons, they bow in front of the house to pay respect to the owner of it. And then they have to have someone help them get up because they're so heavy. So there's always that person, and that's very traditional. And it's always a father and the son that helps them up, and then the son inherits that contraption, and that goes from generation to generation, so forth. So those are all magical acts, not so much witchcraft, but in that sense, magical acts that reflect what people know or feel that they have to face in the Alps, the conditions basically, and how to deal with them, and then find ways to either appease or scare them away, I guess.
That's fascinating. I mean, that ritual you're describing on January 6th in macro form is, like a cultural folkloric festival. But if you were to like turn that into just one person coming to somebody's house, it would just be like completely a shamanic ritual where they're kind of taking, elements of the harshness of weather, giving them like demonic identities and exercising them. It's so fascinating. And yeah, the way that they are handling and dealing with moving things in and out, moving on to the new year, sweeping out the old. It's just, yeah, it's such a perennial expression of that type of, like, to me, that is kind of like a form of witchcraft, in the way that shamanism is a form of witchcraft. That's so fascinating. I love that. Well, to wrap things up, I think I have one more question. I was just curious, you've mentioned a few times your work with people experiencing homelessness. Does your identity as a magical practitioner play into that for you at all, even just your motivation?
I would say that Druidry definitely plays a part of that. But again, uh, you know, dedicating your work or what you do to the benefit of you know society or your community. It's better way to say. So that's definitely something. You know, my skill set again is I come education wise. I'm an economist. I worked a long time in a bank as a risk manager, so analyzing companies and so forth for their ability to pay back loans for big things like airplanes and cruise ships and so forth, protections and so forth. So that was my skill set, with which then decided to use to help homeless folks rather than make more money with banks or make the banks more money. Say this way. So yes, that definitely falls into that realm of druidry, that kind of work.
Very fascinating. Very noble of you. That's awesome.
Thank
Definitely a problem that's not getting any better these days. So, yeah.
No, and then that was a reason why it took a little longer. A meeting about how it's getting more difficult.
Yeah, horrible. But I'm glad you're working on it. We thank you.
We'll see.
I'm very much looking forward to your next book. It sounds fascinating. We'll definitely have you back on. But to wrap things up, is there anything you'd like to plug besides the book, Alpine Witchery, which everybody should grab? Yeah, any events, any new projects? Yeah.
Um, as of now, it's just sort of a don't have anything events coming up. I'm doing a druid gathering soon in September, but that's already pretty much filled up with a number of people that we can host. So um, yeah, and then we'll see what the next year brings. That book itself is, of course, right now my top priority. That comes out. We have talked with the publisher about a oracle deck that would be connected with a book. So that's what we are currently working on. I do have an interview coming up in a couple of days with the Austrian um, public radio station that will be in German. Um, and about that work, especially more about that book about the creatures and so forth than my witchcraft books. But that's pretty much it.
Well, everybody should go out there and grab Alpine Witchery. Such a fun book, really fascinating. And I'm very excited to see the next one because I think it definitely will be on lots of topics we like to dive into here. So, yeah, we'll have to have you back on. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christian. We'll have you back on soon.
Hopefully, I'm excited about that next one too.
Hell yeah. Awesome.